So, a lot of my viewers will be familiar with Northern English monks speaking Old English, writing in Latin, such as Bede, that kind of thing. Richard Methley, the subject of your new book, which I have here, wrote in Latin, and he was a Northern English monk, but in the late 15th century. So, could you tell us a bit about the state of the church, the state of sort of England and the English church around that time?
Yeah, the late 15th century is an interesting period. In the church, it's an age of intense devotionalism, what scholars call affective piety from the word affect. And what that means is a highly, highly emotional form of devotion to Christ and his humanity. So, especially his infancy and passion, his suffering, his body, his holy name, his five wounds. So, a lot of devotion of that kind going on. There were many religious orders that flourished in England: Benedictines, Cistercians, Franciscans, Dominicans, Augustinians, and of course, Methley's own order, the Carthusians. We'll talk about them in a minute. There were also a lot of religious houses for women. Huge numbers of men became clergy and monastics. And there were so many men who entered the priesthood that clerical unemployment was a serious problem. A lot of clerics went to work for secular courts. It was a great age for church building and expansion. To my British viewers, I'll say most of the medieval churches still standing in England today were built in the 15th century, those beautiful late Gothic churches. Rich people were building chantry chapels where priests could sing masses for their souls in perpetuity. A lot of those still stand. The liturgy was mostly in Latin, but preaching was in the vernacular. So there were a lot of sermons given in England. Popular piety focused on what were called the four last things, meaning death, judgment, heaven, and hell. People were terribly concerned about sin and afraid of having to spend a long time in purgatory after they died. So, a big part of the economy, and I mean the material economy, not just the religious economy, was suffrages for souls. People making bequests in their wills to get priests to sing masses for them, making bequests to monasteries and convents to get religious houses to pray for them. This was a big deal. People were very, very eager to die a good death. So, a popular genre of religious literature was the ars moriendi, the craft of dying. Books like this were kind of bestsellers. There was the sale of indulgences, which Martin Luther would soon come along to deplore. But Chaucer already, back in the 1390s, realized that there was a lot of scamming going on. Other practices that were very popular that the reformers would reject were pilgrimages, especially to Marian shrines like Walsingham, and to Canterbury, the great shrine of St. Thomas Becket, where Chaucer's pilgrims go. Devotion to images, miracle working icons. Now, there were some kind of proto-Protestants, if you can call them that, Lollards, people who wanted a much more, what we would say, low church kind of piety, who wanted to read the Bible in the vernacular, who wanted to put an end to pilgrimages. They said the money spent on them would be much better given to the poor, and so forth. So you do have some nascent kind of proto-Protestant protests. But on the whole, Catholic piety was very, very strong in this period.
Yeah, it's hard not when I was trying to picture in my head the sort of setting that Richard is in, it's hard not to think of Chaucer and the sort of religious exemplars he gives. I love you bringing up the Lollards. That's one of my favorite lines in the Canterbury Tales when the host calls the priest, I smell a Lollard on the wind, or something
Yes.
like that, because he got mad that the host had sworn. But we do get a lot of these sort of like corrupt monastic figures, certainly in Chaucer. I don't get the sense that Richard is something like that. But
Now,
perhaps
Richard
it's
Methley is the opposite of a Carthusian figure. He is sincere to the core.
right. Yeah. Perhaps it's best now to talk about sort of his specific group. So the Carthusians you mentioned, um, we have Carthusian monks today. In fact, I have met people who have been to their monasteries, in at least in the United States. What are they? Are they similar? The Carthusian monks that exist today, are they similar to the ones that were in the 15th century?
Yeah, very much. One of the order's favorite mottos is Nunquam reformata quia nunquam deformata, which means the order has never been reformed because it's never been deformed. Um, Everything changes over time, but the Carthusians probably less than anybody else. What is unique about them is they're basically hermits, and yet they live in community. So each monk would have, this is still true today, each monk would have his own private cell with his own garden, and they would eat and sleep and pray and sing the divine office in private in their own cells. And they only came together in community on Sundays and major feast days. So they're kind of a mix between living the eremitic life, the life of hermits, and the cenobitic life, the life of monastics. If you want a little history, the order was founded by St. Bruno in 1084, so it's almost 1,000 years old. And he established the monastery of the Grande Chartreuse, which is in the French Alps. It's a very high, remote site, physically very challenging to live there. That monastery is still functioning. It's the mother house of the order. It's been through many periods where hostile political authorities have shut it down, and then it's reopened. It's had fires, it's been avalanche. So the current buildings date from the 17th century. That's still pretty old. I would highly recommend to anyone who's interested in monasticism, there's a great movie called Into Great Silence. And that was filmed in 2005 with the consent of the monks of the Grande Chartreuse. It took them years to make up their minds to consent, and the filmmaker just patiently waited for them. And it gives a really, really beautiful portrait of their lifestyle. None of them have cell phones. There's only one computer, and that's for the use of the abbot. They do have electricity, but they live not very differently from the way they would have lived in Richard Methley's day.
Mhm. Yeah, hearing the story of the creation of that movie was pretty funny. How the director reached out to the monastery. I think it was 5 years that they took
Yep,
to get back to him.
yep. They have eternity, so they do things slowly.
I thought that was pretty funny. So
Yeah.
now we are in the 15th century with the Carthusians, and we get our main character for today, Richard Methley. So who was he?
Yeah, he was a Carthusian monk, as we've said. He lived at the monastery of Mount Grace, which is in northern England. You can see ruins of it today. Of course, it was torn down in the dissolution. He was born around 1450 and he died about 1527. So he lived a good long life. He died only 7 years before the dissolution of the monasteries, which I think was God's great mercy to him because he didn't have to live through what would undoubtedly have been a cause of great pain to him.
Mhm.
He was the last great English mystic before the Reformation, and he was a prolific author. He wrote a lot of mystical treatises. Most of them were lost in the chaos surrounding the dissolution. About three and a half survive, and those are the writings that I've translated in that book. Um, Clearly, he enjoyed some authority and some prestige as a mystic, as a spiritual director. Um, but English Protestants were not interested in that kind of thing. So his reputation was very rapidly eclipsed after the Reformation. And he was only really rediscovered in the 1980s or so, thanks to the tireless efforts of a Carthusian scholar named James Hogg. Um, and his writings were edited piecemeal in very obscure little publications. And then this volume of translations came out only in 2021. So I'm hoping to put him back on the map again. But he was really forgotten for many, many centuries.
Right. I'll kind of come back to this question later, but initially, why would you say that he's important?
Um, First of all, because mysticism is something we usually think of in England as tied to the 14th century, to people like Richard Rolle, Julian of Norwich, a little later, Marjorie Kemp. And we think of English mysticism as vernacular, but in the 15th century, partly because of censorship or the fear of censorship, mystical writing moved back into the vernacular, back from the vernacular into Latin. And Methley is a key figure there. And he wrote Latin as he spoke it, a very colloquial Latin. And we also think of a certain kind of mysticism, this affective piety, this emotionalism, this very physical, performative, corporeal kind of mysticism, we tend to think of as women's style of piety.
Mm.
But here we see it in Methley, a male figure. And that's important. And it really changes, I think, the way we think about late medieval mysticism.
So you bring up his Latin. I hope you won't mind me saying this, but for viewers who don't know, I think it's not an exaggeration to call you one of the greatest Latinists of our time.
Thank you.
How would you describe Methley's like quality of Latin? How did you find it?
It's weird. His Latin is just weird. Um, as I said, it's almost colloquial. Um, Sometimes it's very casual, but each work of his uses a refrain from the Bible, particularly from the Song of Songs, that great work of erotic love, which was read as a mystical allegory. Sometimes his Latin is really hard to translate because we have only one manuscript of each of his works. And the text transmitted, especially in the main manuscript, is not very good. It's full of grammatical mistakes, it's full of scribal corrections, possibly some corrections made by Methley himself.
Mm.
Um, but sometimes it's really hard to figure out what he's saying. In manuscripts, there's little to no punctuation, so it's hard to figure out where sentences begin and end. It's hard to figure out how to break things into paragraphs. And then when he's not being super colloquial, he's being highly ornamental and alliterative. He loved the writings of Richard Rolle, who was a 14th century mystic who wrote in both English and Latin. And Rolle used this very alliterative style, and sometimes Methley imitated that. And I picked out a choice example to read for you, translating alliterative Latin into alliterative English. And it goes like this. My mind banishes mourning and multiplies music as God's nightingale embraces the bountiful beloved, her brother and son, sustained by blossoms in the arms of his blessing. And he'll do things like that, and there'll be this really purple passage, and then it'll end as suddenly as it begins. And then he'll go back into sort of his normal style. Another thing he likes to do is he was devoted to the name of Jesus. And in Latin, the vocative form would have been Jesu. And so he breaks into these long exclamations where he says, "Oh, Jesu, 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 Jesu." And he just sings out the name of Jesus over and over again. And, okay, what can you do? I mean, you have to put it there because it's in the text, but it reads a little bit oddly.
Yes, it is very, almost off-putting to see it in the text, like written out as just the same name over and over and over and over again. It's visually odd to see it on the page.
Yeah, and I wondered when I was translating, should I just say Jesus? Should I put commas in? Oh, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus,
Hmm.
exclamation point. And I finally decided no, no commas, and keep the Latin form because he meant the reader to perform this out loud. He meant the reader to do what he did and just pray the name of Jesus. Oh, Jesu, Jesu, Jesu. And he said that often when he did this, it would lead into ecstasy. He went into ecstasy often, and he would hear the singing of angels. And this, he believed, was just about the highest bliss that anyone could have in this life. And so that's all very performative. And there's no point toning it down because he wanted it toned up.
Hmm. One thing I thought was interesting, the word tidium, or I guess in ecclesiastical pronunciation,
Hating him.
tedium, you translate not as sort of like boredom. I think you give ennui, which I thought was an interesting choice. And is he avoiding using the term acedia here?
He is, yes. Acedia is one of the seven deadly sins, and we don't really have an exact word for it in English. It's partly boredom, partly sloth or laziness, partly depression. Clinical depression would come under that rubric, partly
Mhm.
despair. Acedia is what a monk feels when he goes, "I can't stand it anymore." And he wants to flee screaming from his cell. Okay. Um, and I think Methley avoided that term because he was writing for his own monks. And he didn't want them to feel that they had fallen into deadly sin anytime that they had dryness in prayer. So he uses this word tedium instead. We could translate it boredom, but it's stronger than boredom. And so I chose the French word ennui because I think the sense that ennui has in French literature is much stronger than our word boredom. So that I think is what he means, just weariness of life, and especially weariness of the religious life.
So earlier you mentioned when he strings out these Jesu, Jesu, Jesu over and over again, you brought up the reason is that he intended the reader to imitate him or at least take from his example. And that brings me to the kind of question of for whom were these works intended? What kind of setting were they composed in?
Yeah, he wrote in Mount Grace in his own monastic cell, um, and his audience is his fellow monks. He uses only masculine pronouns, and yes, in medieval Latin, if you wanted to say he or she, you could say he or she. He never does that. He uses male pronouns. He's addressing fellow Carthusian monks at Mount Grace and at other Carthusian monasteries. Um, but he isn't writing for a wider audience. He's writing for advanced contemplatives, for people who have given their lives to contemplative prayer and who want to hear about mystical experiences because they might be encouraged to seek and to have experiences similar to Methley's own. So it's a very in-house kind of writing. The other thing that Methley does, though, that's interesting, there are two famous Middle English mystical works that he translates from English into Latin, and one of them is The Cloud of Unknowing, an anonymous 14th century work about apophatic prayer,
Mm.
meditation on a mantra, as we would now say. And he thought it would be more accessible in Latin than it was in English. And the other work he translated is called The Mirror of Simple Souls, which was written by a French woman, Marguerite Perret, who was actually burned at the stake for heresy with her
Oh,
book. He didn't know who the author was. He didn't know that she'd been burned at the stake. He kind of suspected that this book might not be totally orthodox, but it had already been translated from French into Middle English. He probably didn't know that it was originally written in French, and so he translated the English version into Latin, again to make it accessible to Carthusians, to
mhm.
people who were vowed to the religious life, who would find it easier to read in Latin than it was in English, which I think tells you a lot about the state of language in his lifetime.
Do we have any idea how or in what setting he learned Latin? Was he a wealthy child?
We don't know anything about his background.
Hmm.
We know that he became uh, a monk in his early 20s. He probably did have some money because he tells a story about how he was inspired to become a solitary when he gave a large donation to an elderly anchoress, an enclosed woman who was
Hmm.
dying, and then she died a few days later. And by her example, he was inspired also to take up the solitary life. So if he made this large donation, he had some money, but he wasn't from a noble family or anything like that. He could have learned Latin at a parish school. We just
Hmm.
don't know. Um, he was certainly ordained a priest, but that was probably after he became a monk.
I see. Well, if we want to get to your book, which again I have here, I'll have it linked in the pinned comments. And I think the sort of meat of the work are these three spiritual treatises, which he writes, and that you translate from the Latin into English. Um, well, I would like to speak a bit to each one individually, but as a
Okay.
whole, what kind of are these? What can readers expect from them?
They're books about mystical prayer. Each one is in a different genre, but that is the common theme. How can you pursue union with God here in this life? And what is it like when it happens? What is the experience of rapture like? What is the experience of ecstatic union like? Why should you want that? And once you want it, how can you get it?
Mhm.
That's his great theme.
The first of them, which you translate the title as the School of Languishing Love. I found I found all three of them interesting. This one, it's a bit more didactic. How would you describe it?
Yeah, it is didactic. It's a guide to contemplation. What do you do if you want to practice contemplative prayer? And there are some passages where he gives really pragmatic advice. Okay, so find a solitary place where nobody will observe you. Sit down on a soft chair, put a cross before your eyes. Um, and while contemplating the cross, say this prayer and then close your eyes and just empty your mind of all words and images and direct your intentions to God. And do that for 15 minutes at a time. Do it 3 times a day, in the morning and after lunch and before bed. And in the evening after Vespers, you can do it for half an hour. And so that's really, really practical advice. Spiritual directors today still give very, very similar advice. Um,
Mhm.
but that's not the most interesting part of the book, I think. The most interesting part is the secular literature of courtly love is still flourishing in his day, and Methley is obviously familiar with it. And courtly love, which is probably has very little to do with the way people actually conducted love affairs, but it's a literary topos. And it's all about unrequited love, and it's all about languishing and how the lover is going to die if he can't be united with the beloved.
Mhm.
And so he presents God and the soul as if they were languishing lovers in a courtly love scenario. So the soul languishes, and by languishes, he means, feels weak and fatigued and just can hardly go on because he's obsessed with the desire for God. But God, and this is the fascinating part, God languishes even more for love of the soul
Right.
because God loves everybody with infinite love. And his love is often unrequited because so many people couldn't give a damn. They're indifferent to the love of God. They're not grateful for it. They never think about God. And so God is the unrequited lover who languishes for love. And he says these are 6 ways that God languishes for love of the soul. And these are 6 more ways that the soul languishes for love of God. And it's just fascinating to read about the relationship with God cast in that language.
Mhm. Being the first text in the book and therefore being the reader's introduction to Richard, it's really fun to see some of the turns of phrase that he uses. I really like the analogy that he gives where he says that if someone's house is on fire, they aren't going to go outside and be like, "Excuse me, my house is actually on fire right now. Is there any chance you could help me?" They would just start screaming like, "Fire, fire!" And
Yeah.
and so in the same way, when he is kind of being pressed by the sort of divine presence, he just goes like, ah, he's just like starts making noises.
It's love, 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 or
Yes.
Jesu, Jesu, Jesu. Yeah. So, right, it's not about rational discourse, right?
Mhm.
And he's very clear about that. It's like being in the throes of love.
Right. I love the analogy as well as the king, he says that when a king decides to build a castle, everyone looks at the castle and says like, "Oh yeah, the king built the castle," but he actually didn't like pick up the rocks and put them there. It was all his advisors and counselors and servants. And in the same way, like the religious life has been instituted by God, but it was the sort of great church fathers and doctors and stuff that were actually building it. I thought it was a very clever turn of phrase.
Yeah, yeah, that's nice. He's good at analogies.
The next work is the Bedroom of the Beloved Beloved, as you translate. That's a kind of interesting title.
Yeah, dormitorium delecti delecti. The phrase the beloved beloved occurs only once in the Old Testament, and it's a mistranslation.
Oh.
But he likes it because it's superlative.
Mhm.
God isn't only the beloved, he is the beloved beloved. And it's in keeping with his extravagant language.
Mhm.
And in that book, it's a dialogue between Methley and Christ. And he represents them as 2 lovers who share a single bedroom. In fact, they share a single bed. And so it's a very erotic work. I mean, he says at one point, it is the habit of companions who share a bed that whatever one of them wants, the other one also wants.
Mhm.
And so, it's an erotic relationship with God. But the dialogue will surprise modern readers because what Methley wants most of all is to die. And he keeps on praying for death. And he was only in his 30s when he wrote this. It's not because he was depressed, he didn't have ennui, he wasn't in pain, he wasn't bored with life. He wanted to die for joy. He wanted to die for love because, on his telling, he experienced raptures and ecstasies and mystical union like all the time, sometimes several times in one day. But at the end of an ecstasy, you come back to the world, you come back to your body, and you say, "Oh, why couldn't this experience have been eternal?" And so, what he wants is to be with God eternally and always enjoy that bliss. And the way to get there is by dying. And so he keeps asking, why do you keep delaying me? Let me come to you. Let me come to you now. And Christ always says, calm down. It's not time yet. You still have work to do in this world. I promise I will take you to myself, but it's not going to be right now. And Methley, the speaker in his own voice, just has to get used to that. He has to accept it. Now, in fact, he lived to be 77, so he had to be patient for a very long time.
Right. Yeah, I love the motif of the bedroom and the fact that they are he includes an argument that's it's like what modern readers might call like actual pillow talk, where they are next to each other in bed arguing, and he's saying like how could you abandon me, or not abandon me. He says, I call out to you all the time and you never listen to me. And God responds like, how could I not hear you? We're sleeping in the same bed. You know? That's just
Yeah,
such an
yeah,
interesting way to put it.
that's right. And some readers would be shocked by the eroticism of the work, but that's the discourse of love that was in vogue at the time. And
Mhm.
Methley is extreme, though, by any standard. He's extreme.
I also thought it was interesting in this book that he keeps almost sort of putting down the pen and then saying like, the last paragraph I wrote right before Vespers, and then I took some time off, and now I'm coming back to the work. I just thought it was interesting to kind of get the constant narration of him writing it, I thought.
Yeah, because he could only write in the snippets of time that he had. He had to say the divine office. He had to celebrate Mass every day. And he had various chores that he had to do around the monastery, and meals and sleep and all that. So he couldn't just sit there for 6 hours at a stretch writing. And you get the sense that he has half an hour and he writes a chapter and then he has to put his quill down. But he will actually tell you quite a lot about his writing process, as you said. And then, I wrote this after Vespers, and now I'm writing the next morning before Matins,
Mhm.
that kind of thing.
It's very vivid. It really helps you to kind of put yourself in the room with him almost, picture
Yeah.
him at work. The third and final spiritual treatise is the Refectory of Salvation, which comes across as really just sort of, I won't say bragging, but he is just listing experience after experience of being sort of like taken into the heavens, being visited by God. It's almost overwhelming.
Yeah, that's his mystical diary. And it's a day by day record, sometimes hour by hour, of his mystical experiences over a period of just 2 months in 1487. And there were enough of them that he could fill a whole book with these experiences. And like even more than the bedroom, it's written in real time. He takes up his quill when he can, he puts it down when he has to, and sometimes he's writing on the edge of ecstasy. He's not even coherent. You can see his Latin
Mm.
is broken down and it's becoming ungrammatical because he's like half ecstatic. And he will give you the exact date and time of each experience. This was important to him. So he'll say, this was on the feast of Saint Sulpicius, and I had this experience immediately after Mass.
Mm.
Or this was on the eve of St. Agapetus, and I had this experience at Vespers. So
Mm.
you get the sense that he's really anchored in the liturgical time. Um, but what interests him is, I was raptured up to the heavens and I saw this marvelous light which no human mind can comprehend. Or, I saw a vision of the Virgin Mary and she told me such and so. No,
Mm.
it's very detailed.
Yeah, the description he uses at one point of that he felt like he was drowning in a vat of wine. He was so drunk with love, or like that was, very, very passionate stuff.
Oh, yeah.
I was also very interested in at one passage he like he's like playing mind games with the devil. He's talking about how he was visited by the devil and how he thought maybe, his strategy for this, would be to do this one, to resist in this way. And then, the devil got bored with tempting him. And so then changed strategies. And then he had to defend himself from that instead. It's very pugnatory.
Yeah, the devil is a familiar presence in his life. He doesn't only feel spiritual temptations, he sometimes visibly sees the devil. At one point, I mean, you don't know what to make of this. He says, "The devil sat down on my right foot, but I paid no attention to him. I went on with my prayers." Okay.
Yeah.
I doubt that any person, however religious today, would say anything like that. But this
Uh,
was his experience. And yeah, he does
right.
play mind games with the devil.
Yeah, I can remember as well. He describes just, I think he was doing something and he felt that someone had like pushed him over, almost like tried to knock him over, as if, he's describing it as if he's like a kid in a high school hall and then some bully like knocks past him and on his shoulder and stuff like that. And he knew that no one else was in the room. He was like, the devil is trying to get under my skin. As if he's like being bullied in high school by Satan.
Yeah, yeah, and the goal is to like say, "Oh, it's just the devil again. Don't take him
Hmm.
seriously," and to try to ignore the devil as far as possible and don't let the devil get a rise out of him.
Right. The fourth work, The Experience of Truth, is fragmentary, which my viewers familiar with Old English literature, that's nothing new. But
Right.
what do we think we lost in the first half?
Yeah, The Experience of Truth is a book that he wrote later. We don't know exactly when, but it's about the discernment of spirits. And the discernment of spirits was a practice. We were just talking about the devil. It was very important to contemplatives to know what spiritual experiences are authentic, namely caused by God, and which ones are fraudulent, is caused by the devil, because the devil disguises himself sometimes as an angel of light. And a lot of contemplatives felt that they could be deceived in taking mystical experiences, raptures, visions, locutions, as real gifts of God, when in fact they were deceptions sent by the devil. So the discernment of spirits is the art of telling the difference, right? And there were a lot of different criteria. The first half of the treatise is lost because there's only one manuscript and it's
Hmm.
damaged. What's probably lost is, in fact, the chapters that would be on diabolical experiences, because the second half, the half that we have, is on authentic spiritual experiences.
One thing that came to mind when I was reading his discussion of whether or not you should trust someone else talking about a spiritual experience. I know atheists who would swear that the experiences these people are having are real. And I know Catholic priests who would say that it was probably all, made up. So I
Hmm.
understand there's a huge spectrum of whether or not we should believe people from this time. Do you believe that, what Methley is describing actually happened?
Yes, I do actually.
Hmm.
Um, I believe that the human mind is capable of extraordinary things, and experiencing the presence of God when God chooses to be present is one of those human capacities that we have, and that mystics are people, contemplatives are people who actually cultivate this capacity for God to a very high degree. So I don't believe he was making it up. I believe this was real. And in the experience of truth, he uses his own experience as a practicing mystic as the source of authority. And he takes a very radical and unusual position, because most people who wrote about discernment, and I'm thinking of people like Pierre Dailly, Jean Gerson, in English, Walter Hilton, say, be suspicious. Never cultivate visions, never ask for them. If you have a vision, if you have any kind of extraordinary experience, don't trust it, tell your confessor, tell your spiritual director, let them decide whether it's authentic or not. And Methley says basically, that's bosh. The Holy Spirit is your spiritual director. And
Mm,
if you have a rapture and you feel perceptible love in your heart, then it's real. So he's really on the side of the mystics and the visionaries. He's not on the side of the skeptics. And the literature of spiritual direction is mostly very skeptical. But again, Methley is a great exception to that.
mm.
He takes them basically at face value.
How does that compare to other figures that you've studied, other sort of visionaries from that sort of, from the Middle Ages in general?
Yeah, well, most mystics, I think it's fair to say, tend to trust that when they feel that a revelation or an experience really is, is from God, that it really is from God. I've written a lot about Hildegard
Mhm.
of Bingen, who lived in 12th century Germany, who was massively learned, who wrote huge books based on her visions. She never doubted that it was God who sent them.
Mm,
Closer to Methley, there's Julian of Norwich in 14th century England. She had one great revelation, which is at the time of a near death experience. And she spent her whole life writing and rewriting and revising this marvelous book, A Revelation of Love, that's based on that visionary experience. And she has a passage toward the end of the book where she says the devil tempted her to doubt. Um, and so she did doubt, and she was still, very sick. And so when a priest came to see her, thinking maybe she needed the last rites, she kind of laughed and she told the priest, I was raving today. I thought I saw the cross bleeding. And the priest took her very, very seriously and said, really? Tell me what you saw. And then she realized, my God, this priest believes me. And I didn't even believe our Lord Jesus Christ. And she thought her
mm.
greatest sin was that she had doubted the vision. And after that, she never doubted again. Um, there are other mystics that say Angela Foligno in 13th century Italy, who doubted all the time. She would have these incredible spiritual experiences, revelations of divine light, revelations of the divine darkness, revelations of the passion. And sometimes she was absolutely certain that God was sending her all of this. And at other times, I think she was kind of bipolar, but she would say, don't believe me. Everything I've ever told you was a lie. It all came from the devil. And
Mm.
then she'd go back the other way and she would believe it. So, there are different experiences among the mystics. Now, if we had more of Methley's works, as I said, probably more are lost than there are that survive. We might see cases where he doubts, but I kind of don't think so.
Mm.
I don't think doubt was one of his temptations.
Do you think him being, I understand a lot, this might be a sort of uneducated take. Most of the mystics that I'm familiar with from this time, as you kind of mentioned earlier, are women. Most of the writings that I've read similar to Methley's are written by women. Do you think the fact that he was a man made him kind of like more confident, like in this kind of thing, or no?
Not the fact that he was a man, but the fact that he was a Carthusian.
I
He
see.
really, he loved and trusted his religious order. But you speak of women, many of our viewers will have heard of Marjorie Kemp.
Yes.
She was an English woman who was born around um, 1370 or so, I forget the exact date. She knew Julian of Norwich. She visited her for spiritual counsel.
Mm.
And then she wrote her autobiography. It doesn't have a title, so we just call it The Book of Marjorie Kemp. and she was illiterate, so she wrote that by dictating to a scribe around 1436. Um, and now the Carthusians, one thing I may not have mentioned about them is they were the copyists and preservers of many, many mystical texts, especially texts by women. So the only text of the shorter version of Julian of Norwich's book, the only text in England of Marguerite Perret, the only text of Marjorie Kemp come from Carthusian monasteries. And the book of Marjorie Kemp belonged to Mount Grace, to Methley's own monastery. And what is fascinating is in the book of Marjorie Kemp, the one and only manuscript, some Carthusian went along and annotated it. He wrote marginal notes in red ink. So scholars call him the red ink annotator. And at
Mhm.
several points, when Marjorie has some kind of ecstatic experience, the red ink annotator writes in the margin, yeah, Richard Methley had the same experience. Uh,
Oh, cool.
yeah, and so he saw a lot of parallels between Marjorie Kemp and Richard Methley. And, we usually think of Carthusians, men, as very austere and aesthetic, and Marjorie Kemp as exuberant and kind of probably half crazy. Um, but this Carthusian who annotated her manuscript took her very seriously, thought of her as a genuine mystic, and compared her a lot to Richard Methley, who obviously was well known and well remembered in his own community.
Mm. In the book, was there a particular passage or section that you found difficult to translate?
Oh, yeah. Lots of passages, especially where the text is corrupt. Sometimes the text is so corrupt that the translator has to basically reconstruct it. And I felt as if I was sort of trying to read Methley's mind. And, I would have to go back to similar passages that said things kind of like that, but in a clearer way. Those passages where he's writing on the edge of rapture, like, what's he trying to say?
Mm.
So yeah, translating him wasn't easy, um, especially because there's only one manuscript. So you can't, often a translator with a bad manuscript can compare it with a better one, but you can't do that in Methley's case.
I wanted to ask, what do you think he would think of the modern world if he were able to see it? You brought up the dissolution of the monasteries. Hopefully, he wouldn't learn enough to find out about that. But what do you think he would think of sort of modern spirituality?
Modern spirituality. Um, I think you would say it needs to be more grounded. It needs to be grounded in scripture. It needs to be grounded in the divine office, which Carthusians and other monks around the world still say. I
Mm.
think he would have kept the modern world kind of at arm's length, as he kept the secular world of his own day at
Mm.
arm's length. He lived in silence and seclusion, and I think he would have been impressed with the spiritual hunger of a lot of modern people, um, but skeptical of this kind of eclectic, sort of curated spirituality where you take a bit of this and a bit of that and a bit of the
Mm.
other. And, here's some Buddhism, and here's some Kabbalah, and here's some centering prayer, and here's some yoga, and that's kind of jumble it all together. I think he would have been very skeptical of that kind of thing.
Right. Now, at the beginning of the interview, I asked why you thought he was important. If I could rephrase the question here to say, why should people read him? Why should people get the book and read Richard Methley? What would you say?
Yeah, um, I'd say there are two main reasons. One is historical and one is spiritual. And historically, he shows us how fervent Catholic piety still was on the very eve of the Reformation. And he offers us a fascinating look an English Carthusian life. There are simply no other writers. Well, there is his companion, John Norton, who was his friend and, whose works have still not been translated, but there are not many writers who do this. As we said earlier, I think he makes us question our ideas about gender. Many kinds of piety we think of as feminine, we find very strongly in Methley. Um, the spiritual reason is for anyone who's a seeker of God. I think Methley is just an inspiring example of how joyful and how beautiful a fully committed religious life could be. The keynote of his works is joy. And that is not true of all mystics. He doesn't write about like terrifying ascetic feats that he performed. Um, he doesn't write a lot about the passion. I mean, clearly he was devoted to Christ in his passion, but he writes about the joy of encountering God. And I think that's something that's good for us to hear.
Yeah, I completely agree. I found the book very inspiring in that way. Folks, the works of Richard Methley is going to be available again in the pinned comments. I'll have the link to it there. Barbara Newman, thank you very much for coming onto the channel.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.